a pretty common narrative that goes around my leadership circles is, no, that's unicorn think. That's not camel think. We're camels, not unicorns. We're building something that is incredibly lean, incredibly purposeful, that's going across the desert to an oasis. And like, if we don't make it, we die. That's how we think. We know we have to get this far on this much money. There's no alternatives.
Welcome to Founded and Funded. Today, Managing Director Tim Porter chatted with Craig McLuckie, who's most known as one of the creators of Kubernetes at Google. Madrona recently backed Craig's company Stacklok, which is actually the second company of Craig's that we've backed. Stacklok is a software supply chain security company that helps developers and open source communities build more secure software and keep that software safe. Tim and Craig discuss Stacklok's developer-centric approach to security, the role of open source in startups, the importance of open source and security, and they also hit on some important lessons in company building, like camels versus unicorns, and where Craig sees opportunity for founders. It's a must listen for entrepreneurs out there. But before I hand it over to Tim to take it away, don't forget to subscribe wherever you're listening.
Well, very excited to be here today with Craig McLuckie. It's the second time I've had the privilege of working together with Craig on a startup. So Craig, awesome to be with you here today, my friend. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, our pleasure. Well, I didn't do it justice. Tell us a little bit about Stacklok and what you're building now and a bit of the founding story. And then we'll double back and talk more about how some of your experiences in Kubernetes and Heptio, et cetera, led you to build this company now.
The story behind Stacklok is it's a little company, Series A company, obviously Madrona backed, that was started by myself and my friend Luke Hines, who was the original founder of a project called SigStore. And the story behind Stacklok actually goes back several years. I've been obviously known for my work in the cloud native computing space and had some success with open source efforts like Kubernetes and a lot of other projects that we built on the back end of Kubernetes to operationalize it and make it more accessible to enterprises. And so open source has really served me incredibly well as a professional. And I've spent a lot of time in open source, building open source communities and navigating those landscapes. Now, one of the things that occurred to me, and it seems kind of obvious, but open source is kind of important. It's like, if you think about it, it really is the sort of foundational substrate for what is driving a substantial portion of human innovation right now. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about generative AI, and you look at something like ChatGPT and you kind of dig into what's behind the scenes, and there's Linux, there's Kubernetes, there's Python, there's PyTorch, there's TensorFlow. All of those are precursor technologies before a lot of that sort of ChatGPT specific IPs even lit up. And that's a pretty significant stack, and it's all open source technology. And so the question that I kind of went through my mind, as continues to echo with me, is like, we're so contingent on open source, but how do we actually reason about whether open source is safe to consume or not as a fundamental building block for pretty much everything we consume? And historically, the currency of security has been this thing called the CVE, right? So there's a critical vulnerability associated with a piece of technology. But increasingly, it's been hard for organizations to deal with this. And my interest in this space predates things like the SolarWinds incident, which really got people starting to think about supply chain security. It only predates the Log4j incident, which continues to plague enterprise organizations. And it really comes down to this. We are so contingent on these technologies, but we don't necessarily have a very strong sense of the security or sustainability of the organizations that are producing it. And we're not necessarily creating the right amount of recognition for organizations that are going above and beyond to produce open source more security. And so what we're doing with Stacklok is really two things. One is we're building a set of intelligence that helps organizations reason about open source technology, not just in terms of whether it is, whether it looks safe, whether it has a low number of vulnerabilities or static analysis being run against it, et cetera, but also increasingly whether the community that's producing it is operating in a sustainable way or not. And so producing that signal is a good starting point. But we also want to make sure that on the consumption side, when organizations are looking to bring that technology in-house and sort of continue to invest in it and build around it, we have the apparatus to drive sustainability, to actually create control loops that enable folks that are both producing open source and consuming open source to institute policies to make sure that they stay within the lines of safe consumption. And so it's really about bringing those two things together in a set of technologies that are backed by open source sensibilities to help organizations navigate this incredibly critical landscape.
That's awesome. So Stacklok is really built on open source, or at least around SigStore for open source, as companies and developers ingest lots of open source, put that together to build their product, and then have to keep that updated over time, right? So those open source projects that fed it continue to be updated themselves. And so you get to track that whole chain. Maybe talk a little bit more about how that works. And then you mentioned SigStore, and how does SigStore play into the strategy here?
So here's one way to think about it. One of the most important things when you're consuming an open source piece of technology is knowing, where did it come from? Now that's it sounds pretty obvious, but it's actually a lot less obvious than people might think, right? So if you go to a package repository and you go and download a package and then you install the package, run the package, you'll look at the package repository's metadata for where that package was published from. So, hey, it was built in this repo by this organization, etc. But how do you know that that's actually the case? Because most of that information is self-reported. It's not actually being generated. A lot of, like the answer might be like, oh, well, we'll sign something. But the answer is a lot of folks aren't even publishing the signatures associated with the public keys associated with signatures. So you really need something that can deterministically tie a piece of software back to its origins. And this is what SigStore has done. It's effectively a bridge between an artifact and the community that produced it. And it's a set of tools that make it really easy for a community that's producing something to actually sign that thing and say, hey, we produced it, here it is, and this is what it contains. Now, SigStore is just one little piece of the story. It ties the software to the origins, but it doesn't tell the origin story. It doesn't necessarily give you all of the insight into, hey, was this community behaving in a responsible way? What does the transitive dependency set look like? Did this community have appropriate security practices in place? And so what we've done is we've created this technology called Minder, which helps communities or consumers of software or producers of software actually operate in more intrinsically sustainable ways. So it basically lets you say, hey, I want all of these policies applied to all of the repos that are associated with producing this piece of technology, and make sure that those repos stay in conformance. So when a new merge request comes along that maybe has something sketchy in it, let's block that merge request and recommend an alternative instead. If someone goes and misconfigures one of your repos so that branch protections are off, let's catch that in the moment and make sure that that can be remedied. But in so doing, you're producing incredibly valuable information about how that community produced that piece of software, which then feeds the machine again. So that all of that information then becomes context that can get written into a transaction log like SigStore, so that the next person who's coming along to consume that piece of software now has that intelligence and can make informed decisions about the consumption of that software. So it's kind of turtles all the way down, because when you look at a piece of software, it's composed of other pieces of software that are composed of other pieces of software. So enabling these organizations that are in the process of composing things together and enhancing them to actually document their practices, write them into a record that can then be consumed by someone subsequently, is an incredibly powerful metaphor.
You mentioned supply chain security, and you talked about some of the major exploits that have occurred, like SolarWinds. Maybe for the audience, put Stacklok in the context of the broader supply chain security market. If it's a market, it's a bit of an umbrella term that gets used by a lot of different companies. I think it might be a little confusing for a lot of people who don't live every day. I think it's a little confusing for customers also. So maybe you can help frame that a bit.
Let's first of all just look at the security landscape and sort of think about how the world has worked. So historically, it used to be a world where the hackers were they were like burglars sneaking around your neighborhood. And they would look for an unlocked window, and then they would open the window and sneak into your house and steal your silverware, right? Like that was the world that sort of existed. Now, what we've seen with incidents like the SolarWinds incident is it's not enough to just lock your windows and turn on an alarm system with some of these active security practices. The burglars are now getting jobs at window manufacturing companies, or are breaking into window manufacturing companies and tampering with the apparatus that produce the latches on windows, so that the windows that are being produced and installed are intrinsically insecure, so that they can then, when everyone's out at a town banquet, they can go and clean out the entire neighborhood, right? Like that's the sea change that we're seeing in the security landscape. And so it's not enough to look at a piece of software today and say, hey, this thing has no known vulnerabilities. It's good. Like no known vulnerabilities doesn't necessarily mean anything. It could be that it's good. It could also mean that it's perfectly malicious, meaning it was produced by someone that was sufficiently sophisticated that it made it look exactly like the thing that you actually want to consume, but they added a little naughty something that's going to really ruin your day when it gets deployed into your production system. So this is really about understanding and knowing where your software is coming from and being able to look at the origins, like understand that full farm to table journey around your software. And now for us, in terms of our positioning, where does this start? It starts with your developers. Like it's not enough to say, hey, we're going to insert this into the production environment, because by the time you put something as a control in a production environment, your organization is incredibly invested in that thing. Failing a Qualys scan in a production environment is the first time you discover you've got a Log4j instance in something you're trying to deploy. That's very painful because you have to go back to the development team. First, you have to figure out who produced that thing. You have to go back to them and say, hey, this is not okay. They then have to go and reproduce it, revalidate it, redeploy it, and get it to you. And it takes an inordinately long time to deal with. So you want to intercept developers at not just at the time when they're submitting a merge request, but when they actually type that import statement and give them signal saying, yeah, what you're doing is good, or hey, what you're doing is probably going to get you hurt later down the pipeline. And then instituting further controls, starting with the Git repository, then moving into the pipelines, then moving into the container registry, then moving into the production environment. So you have these controls along the entire journey, and you're able to look back on the farm to table story of a piece of software that you're looking to deploy.
You mentioned being focused on the developer. I think Stacklok's a very developer-first, developer-centric company and product that you're building. I think a lot of times you think of security software as something that's more top-down. It's a necessary evil. It's sort of being imposed on you from above within management. Talk a little bit more about why it's so important to start developer-first and how it can become, things being equal, something that a developer actually wants to embrace and ultimately create a better experience for their users down the road.
I mean, one of the things that I think is true about developers in general is they generally want to do the right thing, right? It's not like, developers are sitting there saying, you know what, I want to produce insecure code, or you know what, I want to really mess with my ops team's day and produce something that's insecure. They don't want to have to go back and forth with the operations team. But it's also worth recognizing that at the end of the day, they're primarily being metriced on producing software that creates business outcomes. The thing that's going through their head is, I need to, create customer delight through my code. And in creating customer delight, I'm going to create money for my company that I'm working for. And so if you're starting to produce capabilities that inhibit that, they may still want to do the right thing, but they're going to kind of find ways to work around you. And so the later you leave the discovery of something in the sort of left to right flow of a developer's workflow, the more intrinsically painful it's going to be. And frankly, the less likely people are going to be to accept what you're doing. And that's just from the pragmatic side of like getting this technology adopted. And this is a constant challenge for the CISO, which is, hey, I want to introduce this, but the minute I do, my business counterparts come and yell at me because I'm slowing down their production world. So starting with technology that's developer friendly and developer engaging is a good story. And then, frankly, I think, from a business perspective, it also makes sense. Now, it's important not to confuse developers as buying centers. Developers don't have budget by and large. But increasingly, when you look at the IT landscape, developers are just a disproportionately important cohort. Not because they're necessarily going to buy your technology directly, but because all of the people that do buy your technology really care about them, want to enable them, and are going to see you as being a more intrinsically useful capability if you appeal to the developer.
Maybe we'll abstract away a bit from Stacklok and talk more about this notion. I know a lot of the listeners are thinking about, hey, I'm building a new company. Should I open source? Should I not? How do I go about capturing, developer attention and hearts and minds and community? I'll back up just a little bit. So Craig, you co-created Kubernetes at Google and left a while later and started Heptio, which was all around, helping enterprises adopt Kubernetes. And Kubernetes went on to be arguably the most popular open source project in the world. I think there was a point where maybe only Linux had more sort of daily interactions than Kubernetes. And of course, then at Heptio, you built it for 2 years, sold it for $600 million to VMware, and it continues to live on there. I know there's a lot here, and a lot of founders come and talk to you about it, but what are some of the principles that you thought about in building out Kubernetes and now are thinking about, or Stacklok or other companies that are focused on developers and using open source to sort of build this adoption flywheel and community?
There's a hard truth here, and I think this is important for the listeners to really embrace, which is open source is effectively mortgaging your business future for lower immediate engagement costs. So you get lower activation energy. It's a lot easier to get the flywheel turning with open source because it's particularly if you're a small company. One is it's going to create like a virtuous cycle with a lot of the individuals that you want to engage. They may even contribute directly to the project. They'll certainly make it their own. They'll give you, feedback in near real time. They'll build the project with you. It's a wonderful way to build technology. It reduces your barriers to entry in enterprise engagements, particularly if you're a rinky-dink little startup. If you have an Apache licensed open source project, particularly if the IP is foundation homed, you're far more likely to get through procurement because at the end of the day, they know they can just run it themselves if things get weird. So your path is easier. And certainly when I was thinking about Kubernetes, the thing that distinguished us at Google is I didn't need to commercialize Kubernetes. I just needed it to exist because I had something to commercialize it. It was called Google Compute Engines, which had really decent margins. I just needed to disrupt my competition with a technology that I could run better myself on Google's infrastructure, which is what really motivated us to drive the Kubernetes outcome. And, I think with the success of that project, Heptio was really enabling enterprise, was this idea of enabling enterprise organizations to achieve self-sufficiency, to bridge the gap between them and the community, to fill some of those operating gaps associated with the consumption of the open source technology. And that worked out really well. Now, when I look at what I'm doing with Stacklok, I do recognize that over time, if I'm successful with the Minder technology, I will have to accept a lower value extraction narrative than I might do if it was proprietary technology. But realistically, the probability of me succeeding and actually getting something that's consumable out there is far higher if you can actually embrace the community. So I think that the thing you have to do is you have to have a plan. Like, what is your plan for commercialization? So in the case of, Stacklok, I'll be very open with, our customers and the community. Like, our plan is to create incredibly high value contextual data, which we're manifesting as Trusty right now, to support the policy enforcement that Minder has. That represents a differentiated thing. It's hopefully something that our customers will value over time as we bring more and more richness to that data set. And it represents something that's differentiated versus the community open source technology. So that's my my broad plan. Like, and I'm very open. I wear my heart on my sleeve. I don't plan to change the licensing model. I have to stand by my commitments to my customers and to the community that I stand by. But the point is, I do have a plan for commercialization, and it's not just I'm going to be the red hat of this thing. Because it turns out Red Hat is a pretty singular creature. They've done an amazing work of operationalizing at scale, and I think it's folly to assume that you can just repeat that success. But I also say there is another story here, and we see a lot of this, which is, people are happy to pay you to operationalize something. If you have built a system that's, reasonably complex and you're able to operationalize it better than other people, and you're able to, set the sort of boundaries of where, commercial starts and ends and open source starts and ends, you can navigate building a SaaS business around a single vendor open source technology. And we've seen a lot of great companies emerge in that sort of context.
So you built Heptio over a couple years and it was bought. Great journey, faster than probably anyone anticipated when you started. What were some of the things you learned? It could have been about some of these open source threads we're just talking about, or there's a whole host of other just general building startups successfully. What things did you take from that experience that you're making sure to bake into Stacklok? And were there any things that you didn't want to repeat, having done it once before?
I really enjoyed the Heptio journey, and it's hard to complain about the outcome. But I mean, it's also worth recognizing that we were riding on the momentum of Kubernetes. Like, it was a very luckily timed undertaking, and I don't claim to be able to kind of create that kind of luck for myself again. Like, we really need to kind of approach this from a sort of bottoms up perspective. So I think the things that are different with Stacklok, I definitely had a little bit more of the unicorn versus camel mindset. Like, one of the things that's a pretty common narrative that goes around my leadership circles is, no, that's unicorn think. That's not camel think. We're camels, not unicorns. We're building something that is incredibly lean, incredibly purposeful, that's, going across the desert to an oasis. And like, if we don't make it, we die. That's how we think. Like, we know we have to get this far on this much money, and like there's no alternatives. Opportunistic hiring, that's unicorn thing. That's not camel thing. Like, getting kind of crazy with swag, that's unicorn thing, not camel thing. So I think, one sort of essential delta is just a reality of the environment that we're in. It's like, you have to have a plan for commercials. Like the days of being able to raise on promises and a winning smile are over. Like you better have a business plan. And so I think we're definitely a lot more thoughtful in terms of our approach. Like we're much smaller than I was with Heptio at this point. We're 21 engineers, but they are just crazy efficient, really hardworking. We've produced two products in 9 months that I'm very proud of. So that's the one difference. The second difference I'd say is I've approached this with what I think of as a hardwood growth model. So, Heptio was kind of like a linear growth model, and it resulted in a lot of fog of war. We struggled with, folks feeling like they were disconnected because we were growing so quickly. So what we've instituted with Stacklok is kind of a grow hard and grow hard and grow hard and model, like a growth execute and like run the team really hard, produce an outcome, then grow, run the team really hard, produce an outcome, then grow. And I haven't seen that kind of referenced or talked about much, but I'm finding it to be incredibly beneficial just to the culture and to the organization, because you establish the team, you establish the norms, and then you use those norms to kind of direct your next sort of wave of hiring. And then I think the other thing that's, important, in Heptio, we were very kind of, culture forward company. And I think that I'm retaining that culture forward perspective with Stacklok, but I'm being very purposeful in this case that the culture isn't the mission. The mission's the mission and the culture supports the mission. And making sure that as we embrace our hiring practices, we're very, very diligent about, not just hiring the kind of people we want to work with, but hiring people that really have that sense of purpose, that sense of mission, that willingness to engage in the way that we need to. That camel mindset is very powerful.
I love the camel versus unicorn mindset. It's absolutely essential in today's market. The days of the unicorn are distant memories in many respects. You're talking about culture and how you're really intentionally and thoughtfully building it at Stacklok. You wrote this great blog, early on in the company. You called it the operating system of the company. And I like your point about how it supports the mission, but is different than mission. You have these great company tenets that you sort of alluded to. Maybe just say more about, how you're building culture, how you thought about those company tenets. And this is the most common thing between all startups and all founders, right? Is that you building this culture, building it right for authentically you and your team, how that carries forward for the long run in the company is just absolutely essential foundation.
Yeah, I mean, I heard a founder, and I can't remember who it was. I wish I could reference them, but I heard someone say this, and I've adopted it as my own story, which is I have 3 jobs, right? I have to effectively set the strategy for the company. I have to execute the strategy for the company, and I have to define the culture of the company. And of those 3, the third is probably the least understood and the most important. So culture for us is, it is our operating system. It's not just the warm and fluffy things you write on the whiteboard to make you feel good about yourself. It defines how we hire. It defines how we make decisions. It's indistinguishable from things like our brand. Like our culture is our brand. Our brand is our culture. Like it defines us in ways. How I got there, like in my previous company I built with Joe Beta, and like Joe and I are old friends. We'd worked together for like 10 years. We'd done impossible things together. You would not find any air between us. Like you could present us the same data. We'd always formulate the same conclusion. And that was really easy. So when Joe and I started Heptio, first thing we did is sat down, wrote down the culture, and then off we went. Now, with Luke, who is an amazing human being, and I've come to respect in the most fundamental ways that's possible, we were relatively new. We hadn't worked together. We had spent many hours together. We'd gone hiking together, but we hadn't actually worked together. So we both, did this exercise. We wrote down like what we believed. And this is just like drawing on our lived experience. These are the things that define us, that define the way we make decisions. Those little kind of, statements, like Luke says things like, you always have short toes. Like you can't step on my toes because I have short toes. Like you can say anything. I'll just take it at face value. I'm not going to ever take offense. So that's an example of something, he came up with. So we both wrote those down. And then I sat down and did a day exercise where I built an affinity map where I went through all of the tenets, everything that Luke and I feel. And I kind of tried to distill it down into a set of 5 things that I could then articulate that would then represent both what I believed to, represent the way that we operate. Because you can't fake culture. The minute you try to fake culture, at some point, a hard decision is going to come up, and you're going to make a decision that's not aligned with your culture. And then that's going to, hypocrisy is going to creep in, your culture's dead, and you have to kind of start from the beginning. So So I wrote down these kind of 5 tenets, which, are really, pretty simple. Like, we're team first. No one gets lifted up by pushing someone down. We want to make sure that the organization is really invested in this kind of community centricity. Like, I see community as being our asymmetric advantage. So that has to be written into our culture. We're mission oriented. Like, we're a startup, and we're like a camel based startup. Like, there's going to be some long dry patches, and you better have the will to make it to that oasis, right? And the only thing that's going to get you there is if you really believe in the mission. And so I want people that feel that burn, that really want to, engage in this mission with us. I believe that we're a startup, so we have to be data centric. So we have to find truth in data. Like, we cannot ever gloss over a hard truth that's staring us in the face because we refuse to engage with and believe the data. We have to be humble but determined. This is again the camel is a humble but very determined creature. And I think some of the best leaders I've ever worked with have embodied this. And then we're a security company, so I have to stand vigilant. So bringing that all together and then operationalizing it. So when we're talking about hiring candidates, guess what exists in our CMS, the candidate management system? It's these 5 cultural virtues. I expect our interviewers to provide feedback across those 5 things. We talk about how to assess this in people that we're talking to. When we're talking about promoting individuals, we reference back to the cultural elements. So it becomes a very natural part of the company. And then whenever you're having a hard conversation and you have to make a decision, you point back to these tenets, right? So these are the things that are informing our decisions. And so that's how I've approached building a culture.
Fantastic articulation. It's energizing to hear you talk about it, Craig. And of course, you referenced your fabulous co-founder, Luke Hines, and he was a longtime senior engineer at Red Hat, co-creator of the SigStore project that Stacklok is drawing on significantly, and is also based in the UK. So you also have a bit of a geographic and time zone that you're working through, which in this world where companies are at least to some degree hybrid, this cultural blueprint and operationalizing it, I think is that much more critical compared to when everyone can just be together in the same office.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. And in this kind of remote first world that we find ourselves living in, canonizing that and expressing it and being very deliberate in your communications is so critical as a startup founder.
Awesome. Let's come back one more time to Stacklok. And so, you just formed the company and founded it, earlier last year. Incredible pace of building this great team of predominantly engineers that you referenced. Launched the first 2 products, which you referenced, Trusty and Minder. What's up for 2024? Maybe, without giving away anything confidential, what are you looking forward to from a company standpoint this year? And, if there's kind of a call for customers, who should be interested, what type of developer, what type of enterprise the developers there should be looking to Stacklok for help in the areas that we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, I think there's, a couple of things that we're looking to kind of bring to market. For instance, I talk about these 2 things. One is there's Minder, which is a system that helps you mind your software development practice. And so for the coming year, we want to help organizations embrace and engage with Minder. Like, we want to make it free to use from an open source community perspective. We want to support and engage open source communities that are looking to improve their own security posture by providing this technology. Like, they should feel like it's, hey, Stacklok's bringing us something it's really useful. So if you are an open source project and you have, say, 500 repos and you're worried about licensing taint, showing up for some purpose, having something that you can run reconciliation loops across 500 repos and reason about the transitive dependency set and make sure that nothing's showing up in your world that shouldn't show up is useful. So we want to, as a starting point, kind of really engage with communities to help support their use of this technology. We think of this as a way to give to these communities to enable them to start operating security, but also to be able to show their work so that they can start to produce SigStore-based signatures, so they can actually start to generate the attestation signal that the people that are looking to use their projects are starting to expect. So you can see a lot more of that coming down the pipeline. Like right now, we've focused almost exclusively on GitHub integrations, but through the year, we'll add other critical integration points, Bitbucket, GitLab, we'll add Kubernetes and pipeline integration. On the other side, we wanted to start the flywheel going with some high value information. So, while SigStore's, gathering a head of steam, while, these communities are taking time to start producing consumable attestation information, we wanted to precede the segment with some very high value intelligence. So we started by doing some statistical analysis using Trusty, which is basically just doing data science against a lot of open source packages, looking for signals that tend to indicate both vulnerabilities and health. And so you can expect us to continue to enrich that. We're doing some really interesting work. I'm not ready to announce what it looks like yet, but watch the space. We'll start to introduce some very, very sophisticated and very cool ways of thinking about open source technology that complements a lot of what's already out there in the ecosystem. And we'll make that all well integrated into the Minder capability so that you can start to define and enforce policies based on those signals.
Awesome. Looking forward to this year and beyond. A lot of people wonder your point of view on Kubernetes and the cloud native ecosystem. You're firmly focused on building the security company now. Of course, lots of interrelated work with development that takes place around Kubernetes. But what's kind of your view on the state of that community, Craig? Is it at a maturity phase? All the big companies have their hosted and managed services. Do you still see room for more innovation for startups broadly across the cloud native ecosystem? Are there any pain points that you're continuing to hear about? Any advice for founders that are looking to continue to build in your old world?
I think there's tremendous opportunity in that space. Call me crazy. I don't want to be that 80s band that has that one hit song, like sing at corporate events for money in my 70s. Like I want to be able to branch out and try some new things. And the supply chain stuff has been something I'm very passionate about. And honestly, I think, one of the things I've observed is bringing platform sensibilities to the security space. It introduces a very novel way of thinking. Like, look at the security ecosystem. Like, why isn't everything just running reconciliation loops? They work so damn well for, platform sensibilities. Like, why is this not just, like a Kubernetes-esque integration platform? And like, why doesn't this exist? We should just build it. So kind of back to the actual question, I think there's a lot of work to be done. Obviously, generative AI is hot. And from firsthand experience of building and running large language models that we use behind the scenes to produce some of the value that Trusty offers, like there's a lot of fragility and brittleness there. And so, I think there's almost unfettered demand for capabilities to simply operationalize and deliver as a service-like experiences for some of these community-centric large language models. I think in the gold rush of generative AI, the operationalization pickaxes are going to sell very, very well. And, I think that's something that I would certainly be interested to see, where it goes. I would certainly be looking to consume that myself because, right now we just find that operationalizing those models is brittle and can be a bit of a challenge. I think there's still unfinished business in the gap between the sort of platform as a service and sort of Kubernetes layer, right? So the gap between the Herokus and the Google App Engines and the pivotal cloud foundries and the world of Kubernetes still exists. Like, we haven't seen a lot of really great kind of turnkey experiences. I think the work that we started doing with the Tanzu portfolio was a nod in the right direction. But I definitely think there's a wonderful opportunity to continue to explore and play with the idea of the service abstraction and basically looking at service dependency injections for modern workloads. And I'm also acutely interested in the way that WebAssembly is going to start to shape up and represent ways to bring like new atoms of computational resource into new form factors, using and borrowing a lot of the distributed system sensibilities that Kubernetes created. So I think there's tons of opportunity. If I hadn't met Luke Hines and fallen in love with the supply chain security, I can think of 3 or 4 great startups that I'd be happy to do tomorrow. But I'm very happy with the one that we're doing.
We are as well. Thanks so much, Craig. Great insights. We could talk about these things for days, but really want to thank you for spending time and sharing these insights. And it's just a great pleasure and fun to be able to work together here and do a little bit to help you and Luke and the team as you build Stacklok. So thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Really appreciate it.